At 3:17 in the afternoon on October the 12th, 1944, Gefreiter Dietrich Hartmann stepped off an army truck in Princeton, Maine, and his entire understanding of the enemy collapsed in 30 seconds. There was no fence. He stood in a clearing carved from wilderness surrounded by spruce and fir that stretched toward an October sky the color of gunmetal. The air smelled of pine resin and approaching winter. 36 other German prisoners climbed down from the truck bed behind him, their boots crunching on fallen needles. They formed a ragged line, waiting for orders, waiting for the wire, waiting for the towers and the guns that had defined every moment of their captivity since surrender. The wire never came. Hartmann turned slowly a full circle, his eyes scanning the tree line in every direction. Forest. Just forest. Birches standing like pale ghosts among the evergreens. The dark surface of a lake visible through the trees, flat as hammered steel. No barbed wire. Oh. No guard towers, no machine gun nests, no boundary between here and there, between captivity and freedom, between prisoner and man. For 10 years, the Reich had taught him what to expect from the Americans. He had sat through lectures in the Hitler Youth, absorbing lessons about racial inferiors and Jewish conspirators. He had read the pamphlets distributed to Wehrmacht soldiers describing American prison camps as death factories where prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then left to die in their own filth. Better to fight to the last bullet, the propaganda insisted, than to fall into American hands. He had believed them, every word. The truck driver, an American sergeant whose belly pressed against his uniform buttons, walked to the rear of the vehicle and dropped the tailgate with a metallic clang. He looked at the assembled prisoners with an expression Hartmann could not read. Not hatred, not contempt. Something closer to boredom. A civilian emerged from one of the log cabins that ringed the clearing. He was perhaps 50, with the weathered face of a man who spent his life outdoors. He wore wool trousers and a flannel shirt, and he walked with the easy confidence of someone on his own ground. "I'm Earl Dawson," the civilian said. His voice carried across the clearing without being raised. "I run this logging operation. You men are here to work. The rules are simple." An interpreter, a German-American corporal, translated in clipped sentences. "You work hard, you eat good, you cause trouble, you go back behind the wire. Simple as that." Dawson gestured toward the cabins. "Those are your quarters. 8 men to a cabin. Bunks, stoves, blankets. You'll be issued work clothes and tools tomorrow morning. Mess is at 6 noon and 6. Don't be late." Hartmann listened to the translation, his mind struggling to process the words. Tools. They were going to be given tools. In a camp without a fence. "You'll be cutting timber," Dawson continued. "You'll work in crews supervised by my men. The work is hard. The winter here is harder. But if you do your job, you'll be treated fairly." The civilian paused, his eyes moving across the assembled prisoners. "Questions?" No one spoke. What question could capture the magnitude of what they were seeing, what they were hearing? Hartmann glanced at the man beside him, a sergeant named Klaus Brenner who had survived 5 years of war. Brenner's face showed nothing, but his hands were clenched at his sides. "All right then," Dawson said. "Sergeant will show you to your quarters. Wash up. Supper in 2 hours." The American sergeant motioned for them to follow. They walked across the clearing in a loose column, their footsteps the only sound. Hartmann noticed things, small things. The cabins were solidly built chinked logs with tar paper roofs. Smoke rose from several stovepipes, suggesting warmth inside. A path led down to the lake, well worn, unguarded. A tool shed stood open, axes and saws visible in the dimness. Axes. Just sitting there. No lock. No guard. His cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. 8 bunks lined the walls, 4 to a side, with straw-stuffed mattresses and U.S. Army blankets. A cast-iron stove sat in the center, already radiating heat. A kerosene lamp hung from a ceiling beam. In the corner, a bucket of water with a dipper. Hartmann chose a bunk near the window and sat down carefully, as if the simple act of sitting might trigger some hidden punishment. Through the small glass pane he could see the lake and the unbroken wall of forest beyond. No fence. The thought repeated itself, an endless loop his mind could not escape. Klaus Brenner took the bunk across from him. The older man set down his small bundle of belongings and looked around the cabin with the same careful assessment he had once used to evaluate enemy positions. "They trust us," Brenner said quietly in German. The other men in the cabin turned to listen. "Or they think the forest will keep us here better than wire ever could." "The winter will kill anyone who runs," said another prisoner, a man from Bavaria with a frostbite-scarred nose. "I've read about winters in Maine, 20 below zero, 30 below. You wouldn't last 3 days. Hartman said nothing. He was thinking about the axe he had seen in the tool shed, thinking about how easy it would be to split a man's skull, thinking about how the Americans knew this must know this and were giving them the axes anyway. The door opened, and a young prisoner entered, barely 19, with the smooth face of someone who had seen too little of the war to have it written on his skin yet. His name was Conrad Fleischer, and Hartman had heard him crying in the dark during the Atlantic crossing. "There's a shower building," Fleischer said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "With hot water." The cabin went silent. "Hot water," someone repeated. "I saw steam coming out the door. The American sergeant said we could shower before supper. All of us." Brenner stood up. "Show me." They walked as a group to a small wooden structure near the mess hall. Inside, a row of shower heads protruded from one wall, fed by pipes that connected to a boiler in the corner. Steam rose from the grates in the floor. The American sergeant stood by the door, arms crossed, waiting. 15 minutes, he said through the interpreter. "Use the soap. There's towels on the bench." Hartman had not showered with hot water since before his deployment to North Africa. 20 months. For 20 months he had washed in cold streams in rain barrels in the Mediterranean surf. He had scrubbed away blood and sand and the accumulated filth of combat with water that made his teeth chatter and his hands go numb. He stripped off his clothes, the same work uniform issued at Fort Devens, already worn thin, and stepped under one of the shower heads, turned the valve, waited for the blast of cold he had learned to expect. The water came out hot. Not warm. Hot. Hot enough to redden his skin. Hot enough to make steam rise from his shoulders. He stood there motionless as water that felt like a gift from God ran over his body. Around him, other prisoners stood under their own streams, silent, their faces turned upward like men receiving benediction. Hartman looked down at himself. His ribs showed clearly under the skin. His hip bones jutted like blades. He had weighed 153 pounds when he enlisted in 1940. He had weighed 137 when he surrendered in Tunisia. The British field hospital had fed him enough to keep him alive, and Fort Devens had fed him enough to stop the dysentery, but he was still a shadow of what he had been. He reached for the soap. Real soap, not the gritty substitute they had used in the Wehrmacht, and began to wash. The lather was white and clean and smelled like nothing he could name. Like cleanliness itself, perhaps, like the absence of war. When his 15 minutes ended, he dried himself with a towel that was rough but clean, and dressed in the same clothes that now felt different against his scrubbed skin. He walked back to the cabin in silence, his mind working to reconcile what he had been told with what he was experiencing. The Americans execute prisoners. That's what the pamphlets had said. They work you until you die. They humiliate you. They treat you worse than animals. This officer just gave him hot water. Supper was served in the mess hall, a long building with tables and benches and a kitchen at one end where 2 American cooks worked over a wood-fired stove. The prisoners filed in, found seats, waited with the caution of men who had learned that good things often preceded bad ones. The meal arrived on metal trays. Beef stew thick with meat and potatoes and carrots. Slices of white bread with butter, real butter, not margarine. Coffee black and strong. An apple for each man. Hartman stared at his tray. He had not seen this much food on a single plate since before the war. He picked up his spoon and took a careful bite of the stew. The meat was tender. The gravy was rich. The vegetables were soft and seasoned with salt and pepper. He took another bite. And another. Around him, prisoners ate with the focused intensity of starving men. Some ate slowly, savoring each mouthful. Others shoveled food as if afraid it might be taken away. Fleischer ate until tears ran down his face. An older prisoner vomited outside and came back to finish his meal. Hartmann ate until his stomach hurt. Then he ate the bread. Then the apple. The apple was crisp and sweet and tasted like autumn itself. He ate it to the core and considered eating the core. Across the table, Klaus Brenner ate with slow deliberation, chewing each bite thoroughly, his face expressionless. When he finished, he set down his spoon and looked at Hartmann. "They feed their prisoners better than we fed our soldiers," Brenner said quietly. It was true. Hartmann knew it was true. The rations in the Wehrmacht had shrunk year by year as the war consumed Germany's resources. By 1943, soldiers in the field were lucky to get 2,400 calories a day, and much of it was black bread and thin soup. What he had just eaten this single meal contained more meat than he had seen in a week of Wehrmacht rations. A man sat down beside them uninvited. He was perhaps 28, with the hard eyes and rigid posture of someone who had internalized military discipline until it became his skeleton. His name was Otto Richter, and the other prisoners whispered that he had been SS before his capture. "Don't be fooled," Richter said in German, his voice low enough that the American guards would not hear. "This is how they break you. They feed you clean, you make you comfortable. Then they ask questions. They want you to forget who you are, what you swore to defend." Hartmann looked at him. "And who am I?" "A German soldier. A servant of the Reich. The Reich put me in North Africa with no water and no air support, and told me to hold a position against British armor. The Reich left me to die in the desert. These Americans gave me hot water and beef stew." Richter's face hardened. "Careful, Hartmann. That kind of talk is treason. The war is over for us. We are prisoners. What are they going to do, court-martial me? The war is not over. Germany will rise again. And when it does, men will remember who stayed loyal and who became a traitor for a bowl of American stew." Brenner spoke without looking at Richter. "Leave him alone, Otto. Let the boy eat in peace." Richter stood his chair, scraping against the floor. "You will remember this conversation," he said to Hartmann. "Both of you." He walked away. Hartmann watched him go, feeling something shift inside his chest. A small crack in a wall he had not known was there. That night, Hartmann lay in his bunk and listened to the sounds of the camp settling into darkness. The stove ticked as it cooled. Someone coughed. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant water. Through the window, he could see stars, more stars than he had ever seen, scattered across a sky so black and clear it seemed to go on forever. He thought about the axe. He thought about the fence that was not there. He thought about the hot water and the beef stew and the apple. He thought about 10 years of education in the Hitler Youth, 10 years of learning who the enemy was, what they believed, what they would do to you given the chance. Everything they told him suggested this was impossible. But here it was. Real. Undeniable. A prison camp without a fence. Guards who did not carry rifles. Food that prisoners would not see in German barracks. Hot water, soap, towels, trust. That was the word that kept circling in his mind. They were being trusted, given axes and saws and the freedom to work miles from camp with minimal supervision. Trusted not to run, not to fight, not to kill. Hartmann had nothing in his experience to help him understand this. In the Wehrmacht, you were watched constantly, suspected of disloyalty if you smiled too much or too little, reminded that the Gestapo had eyes everywhere, that defeatist talk was punishable by death, that the only acceptable emotion was fanatical devotion to the Führer. Here, no one watched. No one threatened. No one demanded anything except work. He tried to reconcile it with what he had been taught. The Americans were weak, the propaganda said. Soft, undisciplined. Their economy was failing their workers lazy, their military inadequate. They would collapse under the strain of a prolonged war. But the truck that brought them here had been well maintained, the engine running smoothly. The tools in the shed were quality American steel. The food came in abundance, served without rationing or apology. The cabin was weatherproof and warm. Everything spoke of a nation with resources to spare, of an economy producing more than it needed. One of the prisoners had told him that America was making 4,000 aircraft a month. 4,000. Germany was making perhaps 800. The numbers were impossible. Surely propaganda themselves, American lies to demoralize the enemy. But what if they were not lies? What if everything was a lie? Hartman closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. His mind churned with questions that had no answers, doubts that had no resolution. He had believed, he had followed orders, he had marched and fought and nearly died for a cause he thought was righteous. Now an enemy had given him an apple, and the foundation of his certainty was beginning to crack. Morning came with the clang of a metal triangle beaten with an iron rod. Hartman woke disoriented, reaching for a rifle that was not there, his body expecting the harsh reveille of the Wehrmacht. Instead, he found himself in a wooden bunk in a warm cabin, with sunlight slanting through the window. Breakfast was oatmeal with milk and brown sugar bread with butter and coffee. Again the prisoners ate in stunned silence. Fleischer whispered that he had dreamed he was home eating his mother's cooking. He had woken crying, realizing it was only half a dream. The food was real, but home was gone. After breakfast they assembled in the clearing. Earl Dawson stood before them, flanked by 3 American supervisors. One of them was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life in the forest. His name, Hartman would learn, was Harold McAfee. "We're going to issue your work gear," Dawson said through the interpreter. "Boots, gloves, wool shirts, trousers. You'll also get a number. That number goes on your clothes and your bunk and your tool. Don't lose it." They filed past a table where supplies were distributed. Hartman received boots that fit heavy canvas trousers, a wool shirt in red and black plaid leather gloves, and a wool cap. The clothes smelled new. The boots were American-made, stamped with a manufacturer's mark from Pennsylvania. Then came the tools. Dawson held up an axe, the head gleaming in the morning sun. "This is your primary tool. You'll also use cross-cut saws, wedges, and PVs. These tools are sharp. They're dangerous, and we're trusting you with them." The interpreter translated. Hartman watched Otto Richter's face as the words sank in, saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. "You'll work in crews of 6, Dawson continued. "Each crew will have an American supervisor. You'll go where he tells you, cut what he tells you to cut, and work until he tells you to stop. You'll be paid 80 cents per day in camp vouchers. You can use them to buy tobacco, candy, writing paper, whatever we have in the commissary." 80 cents per day. Hartman's mind stumbled over the concept. Prisoners. Being paid. For work. It violated everything he understood about the relationship between captor and captive. Harold McAfee stepped forward. "I'll take the first crew," he said. He pointed to 6 men, including Hartman. "You 6, follow me." They walked into the forest single file, following a path that wound between massive spruces and white pines. The morning air was cold enough to make breath visible. Frost still clung to shaded patches of ground. A chickadee called from somewhere in the canopy, a sound so cheerful and unconcerned with war that Hartman felt something loosen in his chest. They walked for perhaps an hour, maybe 2 miles from camp. The path ended at a stand of tall pines marked with paint. McAfee stopped and set down his pack. "We're cutting these," he said, gesturing to the marked trees. The interpreter who had accompanied them translated. "I'll show you how we do it here. It's probably different from what you know." He picked up an axe and approached one of the pines. "You make your undercut on the side you want it to fall, like this." He swung the axe with practiced ease, chips flying. The rhythm was steady, methodical, the sound of steel biting wood echoing through the forest. After a dozen swings, he had created a triangular notch, perhaps 6 inches deep. "Then you make your back cut on the opposite side a little higher. Leave a hinge of wood in the middle. The tree will fall toward your undercut." He demonstrated, then stepped back as the pine groaned and tilted. It fell with a crash that sent snow cascading from nearby branches, the impact shaking the ground. "Your turn," McAfee said, handing the axe to Hartman. Hartman took it. The handle was smooth, worn by years of use. The head was heavy, perfectly balanced. He approached another marked pine and positioned himself the way McAfee had shown. The first swing felt awkward. The axe glanced off the bark. "Let the weight of the head do the work," McAfee said. "You're just guiding it." Hartman tried again. This time the blade bit deep and he felt the satisfying shock of impact travel up his arms. He swung again and again. Wood chips flew. The notch grew deeper. "That's it," McAfee said. "Keep that rhythm." For the next hour, Hartman cut wood. His shoulders burned. His hands, soft from months of captivity, began to blister inside the gloves. But the work felt clean, honest. He was making something happen with his own strength, his own skill. No orders barked in his ear. No officer watching for signs of weakness or disloyalty. Just the axe and the tree and the satisfaction of competence. At midday, McAfee called a halt. They gathered around a small fire he built, warming their hands. McAfee unpacked his lunch from a canvas bag, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of coffee, an apple. The prisoners had their own rations distributed that morning: bread, cheese, hard-boiled eggs, and an apple. They ate in silence, too tired to talk, muscles trembling from unaccustomed labor. Hartman bit into his apple and watched McAfee across the fire. The American was perhaps 40, with crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and hands that bore a lifetime of scars from axes and saws. He chewed his sandwich slowly, his gaze on the forest around them, relaxed and unconcerned. He was alone with 6 German prisoners, 6 men who had fought for the Reich, 6 men who could kill him if they chose. He had not brought a rifle. He had not even brought a knife that Hartman could see. McAfee noticed Hartman watching him. He reached into his bag and pulled out a second apple, looked at it, looked at Hartman. Then he tossed it across the fire. Hartman caught it reflexively, stared at it. The apple was red and perfect, with a few drops of dew still clinging to the skin. It fit perfectly in his palm. "You look like you could use it," McAfee said. The interpreter translated through the gesture needed no words. Hartman looked up at the American. Their eyes met. In that moment, something shifted. Some wall inside Hartman's chest developed a crack, and through that crack, something unexpected began to flow. "Danke," he said quietly. "I mean, thank you." McAfee nodded. "Don't mention it, son." They went back to work. The afternoon passed in a blur of swinging axes and falling trees. By the time McAfee called the end of the workday, Hartman's hands were bleeding inside his gloves, and every muscle in his body screamed. They walked back to camp in the fading light, following the path through a forest that was growing familiar. That night after supper, Hartman sat on his bunk and looked at the apple McAfee had given him. He had not eaten it. He had carried it back to camp, careful not to bruise it, and now it sat on the rough wooden shelf beside his bunk. Klaus Brenner watched him from across the cabin. "Why don't you eat it?" "I don't know," Hartman said honestly. "It's just an apple." "No," Hartman said. "It's not." It was a gift, an act of kindness, a gesture of trust from an enemy who had every reason to hate him. It was proof that what he had been taught for 10 years might be wrong. He set it carefully on the shelf beside his bunk, unable to eat it yet. It was too important, too symbolic. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the day after. For now, it simply sat there, a small red sphere that contained a universe of questions he was only beginning to ask. The 3rd week of October brought the first hard frost. Hartman woke to find the inside of the cabin window covered in ice crystals that caught the dawn light like scattered diamonds. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Every blade of grass stood rigid and white. The lake surface steamed where warmer water met air cold enough to burn the lungs. He dressed quickly, pulling on the wool shirt and canvas trousers that now carried the smell of pine sap and sweat. His hands had hardened the blisters, becoming calluses, his grip on the axe handle now confident and sure. In 3 weeks, his body had begun to remember what it meant to be strong. At breakfast, the oatmeal steamed in their bowls. Hartman ate slowly, savoring the warmth, the sweetness of brown sugar dissolving into cream. Across the table, Conrad Fleischer was writing a letter home, his pencil moving carefully across the thin paper provided by the camp commissary. "What are you telling them?" Hartmann asked. Fleischer looked up, his young face uncertain. "The truth. That we work hard but eat well. That the Americans treat us fairly. That I am healthier now than when I was a soldier. Your family will not believe you. I know. My mother will think I am writing under duress, that someone is forcing me to say these things." He went back to his letter. "But it is still the truth." The work that day took them deeper into the forest to a stand of old-growth pine that had been marked for harvest. Harold McAfee led the crew with his usual quiet competence, pointing out which trees to take, which to leave for seed. The work had developed a rhythm. The bite of the axe, the rasp of the saw, the warning shout as a tree began its fall, the ground-shaking crash of impact. Hartmann found himself working alongside a prisoner named Georg, a former corporal from Hamburg who rarely spoke but worked with mechanical efficiency. They were using a two-man crosscut, saw its 6-foot blade moving back and forth through a pine trunk 3 feet in diameter. "Push, don't pull," McAfee had taught them. "Let your partner do the pulling. You just push. If you both pull, you'll bind the blade." It was a lesson in cooperation, in trusting the man on the other end of the saw to do his part while you did yours. Hartmann felt the rhythm of it, the way Georg's pull became his push, the way they could work for an hour without speaking and still move in perfect synchronization. When the tree finally fell, McAfee came over to inspect the stump. "Clean cut," he said. "You two work well together." It was a small compliment, but Hartmann felt it settle somewhere in his chest. Recognition, approval, the acknowledgement that he had done something competent and useful. At midday, they gathered around the fire again. The routine had become familiar. The sandwiches and coffee, the apples, the brief rest before the afternoon's labor resumed. But today, something was different. McAfee was studying Hartmann with an expression that suggested he was coming to a decision. Finally, he spoke. "You speak any English, Hartmann?" The interpreter started to translate, but Hartmann held up a hand. "Little," he said in English. "I learn." McAfee nodded. "Good. You're smart. I can see that. You watch, you listen, you figure things out." He pulled a small book from his pack. "My daughter gave me this. Said I should try to talk to you fellows, see if we can't understand each other a bit better." It was a German-English phrase book, well worn with pencil marks in the margins. "She's 16, McAfee continued. "Sarah, smart as a whip, wants to be a teacher someday." He flipped through the pages. "She says if we can talk to each other, maybe we won't be so eager to kill each other next time." Hartmann felt something catch in his throat. "I have sister," he said slowly in English. "Greta. Same age. 16. Yeah. Where is she now?" "Stuttgart. With my mother. I hope." The words came haltingly, each one chosen with care from his limited vocabulary. McAfee was quiet for a moment. Then he handed the book to Hartmann. "Keep it. Study it in the evenings. I'll help you with pronunciation." "I cannot." "You can. Sarah would want you to have it. She'd say it's doing more good here than sitting on our shelf at home." Hartmann took the book carefully, as if it might break. The cover was soft, with handling the pages dog-eared and marked with someone's careful notes. Inside the front cover, written in a young hand, was "Property of Sarah McAfee. If found, please return." "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. That evening after supper, Hartmann sat on his bunk with the phrase book open on his lap. Around him, the other prisoners were engaged in their own pursuits. One group played cards with a deck provided by the camp commissary. Another wrote letters. Klaus Brenner was reading a German translation of Jack London that someone had found in the camp's small library. Hartmann worked through the phrases methodically. "Good morning, good afternoon. How are you? I am well, thank you. Please. The weather is cold, the tree is tall. I am hungry, I am tired." Simple words, basic sentences, but each one was a brick in a bridge he was building between the world he had known and the world he was discovering. Conrad Fleischer came and sat beside him. "Can I see?" Hartman handed him the book. The young man flipped through it, his lips moving as he tried out the sounds. "This is good. This is very useful." He looked at Hartman. "Do you think they will let us stay after the war, I mean? We are prisoners, Conrad. They will send us home when it ends." "But what if home does not want us back? What if we are seen as traitors for surrendering, for eating American food and learning American words?" It was a question Hartman had been avoiding. The thought of returning to Germany, to a defeated nation that might view its returned prisoners with suspicion or contempt, filled him with dread. But the alternative, staying in America, becoming something other than German, seemed equally impossible. "We survive," Hartman said. "That is all we can do, survive and try to become better than we were." Otto Richter appeared in the doorway, his face hard in the lamplight. He had been avoiding the Maine group, spending his evenings with 3 other prisoners who shared his unwavering devotion to the Reich. "Still studying your American lessons, Hartman?" His voice carried contempt. "Learning to be a good little prisoner." Hartman closed the book. "Learning to speak to the people who feed me." "They feed you to make you compliant, to make you forget." "Forget what?" "Who you are, what you swore." Hartman stood slowly. He was tired of this, tired of Otto's constant needling, tired of pretending that loyalty to a defeated cause was more important than the reality in front of his eyes. "I swore to defend Germany," he said quietly. "Not to starve in an African desert, not to die for officers who abandoned us. I swore to serve my country, and my country sent me to die for nothing." He took a step closer to Otto. "These Americans gave me hot water and honest work. That is more than the Reich ever gave me. You are a traitor. No, I am a man who can see the truth. You are a man who chooses to be blind." Klaus Brenner stood up from his bunk. "That's enough, Otto. Leave him alone." Otto's eyes moved between them, calculating, weighing odds. Finally, he turned and left without another word. Brenner sat back down heavily. "You made an enemy there." "I think I already was his enemy. I just stopped pretending otherwise." "Be careful. Men like Otto are dangerous, even here, especially here where he feels control slipping away." Hartman nodded, but his mind was already returning to the phrasebook, to the work of building his bridge word by word. The 4th week brought rain. Cold, steady, the kind of rain that found every gap in clothing and turned the forest floor into a bog of mud and fallen needles. They worked anyway, their wool shirts heavy with water, their boots squelching with each step. On the 3rd day of rain, Earl Dawson made an announcement at breakfast. "Weather's too dangerous for logging. We're taking the day to maintain equipment. Tools need sharpening, cabins need repairs. You'll work in camp today." Hartman spent the morning in the tool shed, learning to sharpen axes on a grinding wheel. An older American supervisor, a man named Charlie, who had lost his left hand in a logging accident years before, showed him the technique. "You want an edge you can shave with," Charlie said, running his thumb carefully along a blade. "Not so sharp it chips on the first swing, but sharp enough to bite clean." He demonstrated his single hand working the axe against the spinning stone with practiced ease, sparks flying. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical. "Your turn." Hartman took over his hands, finding the rhythm, the angle. Charlie watched critically, occasionally reaching out to adjust his grip or the blade's position. "You got good hands," Charlie said after a while. "Carpenter's hands, maybe. You do that kind of work before the war." "My father was carpenter. I learned from him small boy." The English came more easily now, though still broken. "Good trade. Always need carpenters. My boy's learning it now down in Portland. Rather he do that than logging. Logging's hard on a man's body." Hartman glanced at Charlie's missing hand. The older man caught the look and smiled. "Yep, that's how I lost it. Tree barber chaired on me back in 36. Split up the middle, kicked back. I was lucky it was just the hand." You still work? After this? What else am I going to do? Sit home and feel sorry for myself? Work is work. A man needs work to feel like a man. It was a philosophy Hartmann understood. In the Wehrmacht, soldiers who could not fight were discarded. Injured men were often given desk jobs if they were officers, or sent home to uncertain futures if they were enlisted. But here, a man who had lost his hand in a terrible accident still worked, still contributed, still held his dignity. That afternoon, Sarah McAfee appeared at the camp. She arrived in her father's truck, pulling up to the mess hall with a cargo of supplies, flour, sugar, canned goods. Hartmann was carrying firewood to one of the cabins when he saw her climb out of the cab. She was younger than he had imagined, slight and dark-haired, moving with the confident energy of someone who had grown up in these woods. She saw him watching and waved. Hartmann froze, uncertain. Prisoners did not wave at civilians, certainly not at young women. But she had waved at him, and to ignore it would be rude. He raised a hand in return, awkward, feeling the eyes of both the American guards and the other prisoners on him. Sarah said something to her father, who was unloading sacks of flour. Harold McAfee looked over at Hartmann, then back to his daughter. They had a brief conversation that Hartmann could not hear. Then Sarah walked over to him. "You're Dietrich Wright. My dad says you're learning English." He understood perhaps half the words, but the meaning was clear enough. "Yes, I learn. Your book very helpful. I'm glad. Can I ask you something?" He nodded, wary. "Why are you here? I mean, why did you fight for Germany? You seem like a nice person." It was the most American question imaginable. Direct, innocent, asked without guile or understanding of how complex the answer really was. "I born German," he said slowly. "Is my country. When your country say fight, you fight. Yes, I guess. But what if your country is wrong? Then you learn this too late, after you already soldier." She considered this, her young face serious. "That's really sad." "Yes, is very sad," Harold McAfee called out. "Sarah, let the man work." She rolled her eyes, a gesture so normal, so unmarked by war or ideology, that Hartmann almost smiled. "I have to go, but keep studying. Maybe when the war is over you can stay here. Maine needs good people." She ran back to the truck before he could respond. Hartmann stood holding his armload of firewood, watching her go, his mind turning over her words. Maine needs good people, as if he could be good. As if where he came from and what he had done could be set aside for something as simple as being useful. November arrived with the first serious snow. 8 inches fell overnight, transforming the camp into something from a German fairy tale. The prisoners woke to find the world muffled and white, every edge softened, every sound dampened. At breakfast, Earl Dawson made an announcement that sent a ripple of disbelief through the assembled prisoners. "Snow's too deep for safe logging. We're taking the day off. Stay in camp, keep warm, rest up. We'll start again when the snow settles." The interpreter translated. The prisoners looked at each other, waiting for the other shoe to drop. A day off. Because the weather was bad. Not punishment, not forced labor clearing snow, just rest. In the Wehrmacht, idle soldiers were put to meaningless tasks, digging holes to fill them in again, marching back and forth, cleaning weapons that were already clean. Idleness was seen as the enemy of discipline, a slackness that had to be beaten out of men. But Dawson was telling them to rest. Hartmann spent the morning watching the snow fall through the cabin window. The flakes were large and soft, drifting down in that lazy way that suggested the storm would last all day. Klaus Brenner sat at the table writing a letter to his wife in careful, precise German. "What are you telling her?" Hartmann asked. Brenner looked up. "That we are being treated well, that the work is hard but fair, that the Americans do not abuse us." He set down his pen. "She will not believe it. She will think I am being coerced." "Are you?" "No. That is what makes it strange. Every word is true, and yet I can hardly believe it myself." Conrad Fleischer was teaching himself to carve using a small knife purchased from the commissary and a piece of pine. His hands moved slowly, carefully, shaving away curls of wood. The shape emerging was crude but recognizable, a bird perhaps, or an attempt at one. "My grandfather carved," he said to no one in particular. "He made toys for children in Hamburg, little horses, soldiers, dogs. I watched him when I was small. I always wanted to learn." "Why did you not?" Brenner asked. "There was always something else. School, then Hitler Youth, then the war. Always something more important than sitting quietly and making things." Hartmann understood. His own father had tried to teach him the carpenter's trade, but the Reich had other plans. Youth belonged to the state, and the state needed soldiers, not craftsmen. That evening, something unprecedented happened. Earl Dawson appeared at their cabin with an armload of books. German books, somehow acquired from sources Hartmann could not imagine. "Library sent these up from Bangor," Dawson said through the interpreter. "Figured you men might want something to read. We'll set up a shelf in the mess hall. Honor system. Take what you want. Return it when you're done." The books were a mix of German classics, Goethe, Schiller, Heine, and more recent works. Someone had even included a German translation of American novels: Steinbeck, Hemingway, Mark Twain. Hartmann selected a copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in German translation. He had never read it. Had never read any American literature. It had been dismissed in school as inferior, decadent, the product of a mongrel culture. He opened it that night and began to read. Within 3 pages, he was absorbed. The story of a boy growing up along the Mississippi River, getting into trouble, having adventures. It was so far from his own experience, and yet somehow universal. Tom Sawyer worried about school and girls, and the adult world he did not yet understand. His concerns were human concerns, unmarked by ideology or nationalism. "Is it good?" Klaus asked from his bunk. "Yes, very good." "What is it about? A boy, an American boy?"
"He is. I do not know the word. He makes trouble, but his heart is good."
"Mischievous," Klaus said in English, then repeated it in German. "That is the word you want." The next day, the snow had stopped, but the world remained white. The logging crews went back to work, breaking trail through snow that reached their knees. The work was even harder now, the cold biting through their wool clothes, their breath freezing in their beards. But something had shifted. Hartmann could feel it in the camp, in the way the prisoners moved and talked. The day off had been a gift, unexpected and unearned. It had been trust. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that trust was being returned. In the 6th week, Hartmann was assigned to a new work crew. The supervisor was a man named Tom Wilkins, younger than McAfee, with a quick smile and an easygoing manner that seemed at odds with the hard work of logging. The crew included Otto Richter. Hartmann felt the tension immediately. Otto worked with fierce intensity, attacking each tree as if it had personally offended him. He refused to speak to Wilkins, except through the interpreter, refused to acknowledge Hartmann's existence. At midday, when they stopped for lunch, Otto sat apart from the others. Wilkins noticed. "That fellow always this friendly?" he asked Hartmann. Hartmann's English had improved enough to understand. "He is, difficult. He believes still in Germany winning war." "War's over for you boys. Surely he can see that." "What we see and what we believe, not always same thing." Wilkins nodded thoughtfully. "Fair point. My brother's in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. I imagine they got fellows just like your friend Otto, men who'd rather die than admit they lost. This is sad thing, to die for being proud." "Yep, that it is." They ate in silence for a while. Then Wilkins said, "You're doing good work, Hartmann. I've been watching. You're strong, you learn fast, and you don't complain. That counts for something." The praise was unexpected. Hartmann felt heat rise to his face. "Thank you." "No, I mean it. When this war ends, if you want to stay in America, I'll vouch for you. Men like you we can always use." Hartmann stared at him. "Stay in America?" "Sure, why not? You like the work, don't you? And from what I hear, Germany's going to be a mess for a long time. Might be easier to start over here."
It was the second time someone had suggested he might stay. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. To leave Germany, to abandon everything he had known to become something other than what he was, it seemed impossible. But so had this. All of this. The camp without fences, the trust without surveillance, the kindness without motive. "I think about this," Hartman said finally. That night he lay in his bunk and did exactly that. Thought about what it would mean to stay, to learn English fluently, to work as a carpenter in a country that seemed to have unlimited resources and opportunities, to become American, to become the enemy he had been taught to hate. Except they were not the enemy. That was the truth he could no longer avoid. They were just people. People who worked hard and ate well and trusted strangers with axes. People who gave their prisoners hot water and libraries and days off when the snow was too deep. People who saw a German soldier and offered him a future. The apple McAfee had given him weeks ago had long since been eaten. But Hartman kept the core dried and shriveled on the shelf beside his bunk. A reminder, a talisman, a symbol of the moment when everything he believed began to change. Outside November, wind howled through the spruce trees. Inside the cabin was warm, the stove glowing red. His bunkmates slept there breathing steady and deep. For the first time in years, Hartman felt something approaching peace. Tomorrow he would swing an axe. He would cut down trees. He would do honest work for honest pay in a place that trusted him to be more than what the war had made him. Tomorrow he would take another small step away from who he had been and toward who he might become. But tonight he simply slept dreamless and warm in a prison without walls. December came to Princeton with a cold that felt like a living thing. The thermometer outside the mess hall read 12 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of the 1st, and that was before the wind. Hartman learned a new English phrase from Harold McAfee: wind chill, the combination of temperature and moving air that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. "You boys from North Africa," McAfee said, shaking his head. "This must feel like another planet." It did. Hartman had known cold in the desert the nights when temperatures dropped and men huddled around fires made from scrub brush and dried camel dung. But this was different. This cold had weight and intention. It searched for gaps in clothing, found them, and drove inward like knives. The work continued anyway. Trees fell in the frozen forest, their crashes echoing differently in the cold air, sharper and more final. The prisoners learned to work faster to stay warm, learned to recognize the early signs of frostbite, learned that wet meant death and dry meant survival. Hartman's vocabulary expanded with the weather. Frostbite, hypothermia, windbreak, layering. Each word was a tool for survival, and he collected them with the same care he had once collected German military terminology. His body had changed. When the camp doctor conducted monthly weigh-ins in the first week of December, Hartman stepped on the scale and watched the needle settle at 158 pounds. He had gained 21 pounds since October. His face had filled out. His ribs no longer showed like barrel staves. His arms had the ropey muscle of someone who swung an axe 8 hours a day. "You're healthier than when you were a soldier," the doctor said through the interpreter. It was the same thing he had told several of the prisoners. A clinical observation that carried enormous weight. Klaus Brenner had gained 18 pounds. Conrad Fleischer had gained 23, his boyish frame finally achieving something like adult proportions. Even Otto Richter, who ate his meals with visible resentment, had gained weight. The evidence was irrefutable and measurable. They were being cared for better as prisoners than they had been as soldiers of the Reich. On December 8th, Earl Dawson made an announcement at breakfast. 2 weeks from now is Christmas. We're going to do it right. Big meal day off the works. In the meantime, any man who wants to send a letter home for the holidays, get it to the mail office by the 15th. Red Cross will do their best to get it there. The prisoners had been allowed to write letters since their arrival, but this was different. This was official acknowledgement that they had families, that those families might want to hear from them during a season that carried meaning on both sides of the Atlantic.
That evening, Hartman sat at the table in his cabin with a sheet of paper and a pencil. He had written twice before brief notes, assuring his mother he was alive and well. But this felt different. This required more than simple facts. He began to write in German, the words coming slowly, telling his mother about the cold, the work the Americans who treated them fairly. He told her about Harold and Sarah McAfee, about learning English, about becoming someone different. He did not know if she would believe him. He barely believed it himself. The work in the second week of December took them to a new section of forest, a stand of old-growth spruce that had been designated for harvest. The trees were enormous, 4 and 5 feet in diameter, their trunks rising straight and true for 100 feet before the first branches appeared. Lieutenant James Cooper appeared at the worksite that day. He had been a rare presence in the camp, appearing occasionally to file reports and ensure compliance with whatever regulations governed prisoner labor. But today he came to the forest. During the midday break, Cooper approached the fire where Hartman and 3 others were warming themselves. He stood for a moment without speaking, then sat down on a log opposite them. "You men speak English?" he asked. Hartman nodded. "Little. I learn." Cooper stared into the fire. "I was at Normandy, Omaha Beach, June 6th. The interpreter started to translate, but Cooper waved him off. "Let him try to understand." Hartman understood. Omaha Beach was a name that meant something even to German soldiers. The invasion. The beginning of the end. "My brother was with me," Cooper continued. His voice was flat, factual, as if he were reading from a report. "Tom Cooper, 24 years old. He taught history at a high school in Massachusetts. He loved teaching. He was good at it. He made his students think, really think about why things happened the way they did." Cooper pulled out a cigarette lit. It drew smoke deep into his lungs. "We hit the beach at 06:30. Machine gun fire from the cliffs. Artillery. Mortars. It was hell. Worse than hell, because at least hell is supposed to make some kind of sense." He exhaled slowly. "Tom made it about 50 yards. A machine gun got him. German machine gun. MG-42. I saw him go down. I couldn't get to him. The tide came in and took him back out to sea. We never found his body." Hartman felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "I hated you," Cooper said, looking directly at Hartman. "All of you. Every German who ever put on a uniform. I wanted you to suffer the way Tom suffered, the way I suffered watching him die." He took another drag on his cigarette. "But then I got sent here, and I watched you work, watched you eat, watched you learn English from phrase books and send letters home to your mothers. And you know what I realized?" Hartman shook his head slowly. "You're just like Tom. You probably taught something or built something or had some normal job before the war turned you into a soldier. And you probably didn't want to be on that beach any more than Tom wanted to be there. But there you were doing what your country told you to do, same as him." Cooper stood up, dropped his cigarette into the snow where it hissed and died. "I'm not saying I forgive you. I'm not even sure that makes sense. But I'm trying to understand that the man who killed my brother might have been someone just like you, just following orders, just doing his duty, just trying to survive." He looked at Hartman for a long moment. "War makes murderers of good men. That's what I learned. The real enemy isn't you. It's the war itself." He walked away before Hartman could respond, leaving the prisoners sitting in silence around the fire. That night, Hartman could not sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Lieutenant Cooper's brother, thinking about all the men he had killed or helped to kill in North Africa, thinking about whether any of them had brothers who stood at their graves and tried to make sense of senseless death. Klaus Brenner's voice came from across the cabin, quiet in the darkness. "You are awake?" "Yes." "Cooper's story troubles you?" "It should trouble everyone. Yes, it should." Brenner was silent for a moment. "I had a son. Did I ever tell you that—"
No. Friedrich. He would be 21 now. He died in Russia. Stalingrad. I received the letter in February 1943. Missing in action, presumed dead. Brenner's voice was steady, but Hartmann could hear the effort it took. The letter said he died heroically, that he gave his life for the fatherland. All the usual lies they tell to make it bearable. I am sorry. Why you did not kill him. The cold killed him, or hunger, or a Russian bullet, or maybe he just gave up like so many did. Lay down in the snow and never got up again. Brenner shifted in his bunk. But someone's son killed him. Some Russian boy who probably did not want to be there any more than Friedrich wanted to be there. And now both of them are dead, and the world has 2 fewer sons. What do we do with this? Hartmann asked. How do we live with knowing what we have done? We live by being better than we were. We live by learning from it. We live by making sure if we ever have the chance that we do not let it happen again. It was not an answer, but it was something. A path forward through the darkness.
On December 15th, Earl Dawson did something unexpected. He wheeled a radio into the mess hall after supper, a large console model that must have come from his own home. BBC German service, he announced through the interpreter. Figured you men might want to hear news in your own language. It's important you know what's happening. The prisoners gathered around as Dawson tuned the dial. Static crackled, then a voice emerged speaking crisp, educated German. The news was grim. The Ardennes offensive, what the Allies were calling the Battle of the Bulge, was collapsing. German forces were in retreat. The Red Army had crossed into Poland. Berlin was being bombed daily. The prisoners listened in silence. Some faces showed grief. Others showed resignation. A few showed something that might have been relief. Otto Richter stood suddenly, his face twisted with rage. He crossed the room in 3 strides and struck the radio with his fist once, twice, trying to silence the voice that was telling truths he could not accept. "Lies!" he shouted in German. "British propaganda! All lies!" Earl Dawson stepped between Otto and the radio, his face calm but firm. "That's enough. Sit down or go back to your cabin." Otto turned on Hartmann instead. "You believe this? You believe we are losing?" Hartmann met his eyes steadily. "Yes, I believe it, because it is the truth." "How can you say that? How can you—" "Because I have eyes, Otto. Because I have spent 2 months watching American trucks and American tools and American food arrive without end. Because they have built 4,000 aircraft while we built 800. Because the evidence is everywhere if you choose to see it. Then you are a traitor." "No," Hartmann said quietly. "I am a man who finally sees clearly. You are a man who chooses blindness because the truth is too painful." Otto lunged. Klaus Brenner caught him, held him back with surprising strength. "Enough! This solves nothing!" Otto wrenched free and stalked out of the mess hall. 3 other prisoners followed him, the same 3 who had been his constant companions. Hartmann watched them go, feeling something settle in his chest. A line had been drawn. He was on one side, Otto was on the other, and he knew with sudden certainty what Otto would do next. December 24th arrived with clear skies and temperatures that had climbed all the way to 28 degrees. It felt almost warm after weeks of single digits and sub-zero nights. The camp had been decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Someone had fashioned a wreath for the mess hall door. The prisoners had been given the day off. They gathered in small groups, some writing letters, others playing cards, a few attempting to craft small gifts from scraps of wood. Conrad Fleischer had carved a series of small figures, a dog, a horse, a bird, and wrapped them in paper saved from Red Cross packages. At 3 in the afternoon, Red Cross packages were distributed. Each prisoner received a box containing cigarettes, chocolate coffee soap, and various small luxuries that had seemed impossibly distant just months before. Hartmann opened his, carefully removing each item and examining it as if it were treasure. Supper was announced for 5 o'clock. When the prisoners filed into the mess hall, they stopped in amazement. The tables had been decorated with candles and more pine boughs. The smell of roasting meat filled the air, and at the center of each table sat platters of food that seemed to have come from another world entirely. Roasted turkey, 3 of them enormous birds that must have weighed 20 pounds each, mashed potatoes in huge bowls, steam rising, gravy in pitchers, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls with butter, carrots and peas and creamed onions, and at the end of the table pies, pumpkin and apple and mincemeat enough for every man to have a full slice. Earl Dawson stood at the front of the room. "Merry Christmas, gentlemen. This is how we do Christmas in Maine. Eat until you can't move. That's the tradition." The prisoners sat slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear if they moved too quickly. Hartmann found himself at a table with Klaus Brenner, Konrad Fleischer, and 3 others. They stared at the platters in front of them. "This is not real," Fleischer whispered. "This cannot be real." "It is real," Klaus said. "Take some before I eat it all myself." They served themselves, and then they ate. The turkey was moist and tender, the gravy rich with drippings and herbs. The mashed potatoes were smooth as silk, the butter pooled in golden wells. Hartmann had not tasted food like this since before the war, in those distant days when his mother's kitchen still had cream and sugar and meat that did not come from tins. Konrad Fleischer began to cry. Not sobbing, just tears running down his face as he ate. "My mother used to make Christmas dinner," he said. "Before the war, before the rationing. This is like being home." After the main course, after the pies had been distributed and devoured, Harold McAfee stood up. He had brought his guitar, an old instrument with a worn finish and strings that looked as if they had been replaced many times. "Don't know if you fellows celebrate Christmas the same way we do," he said, "but I thought we might share some music, if that's all right." He began to play. The melody was instantly recognizable, simple and pure. "Silent Night." McAfee sang the first verse in English, his voice rough but true. The American supervisors and guards joined in, their voices blending. Then Hartmann stood. Hartmann. He did not plan it, did not think about it. He simply stood and began to sing in German. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft einsam wacht." His voice cracked on the first words. He had not sung in years, but he continued. Klaus Brenner rose and joined him, then Konrad, then others, until all the German prisoners were standing singing the carol in their own language while the Americans sang it in theirs. The melody was the same. The meaning was the same. For 3 minutes in a rough logging camp in the Maine wilderness, there was no war. There were only men far from home singing about peace on earth, goodwill toward men. When the last note faded, there was silence. Several prisoners were crying openly. Several Americans looked away, blinking hard. Lieutenant Cooper stood in the corner. Hartmann saw tears on his face, reflecting the candlelight. Otto Richter stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the door and out into the night, slamming it behind him. Near midnight, Hartmann walked outside. The sky had cleared completely, and the stars burned with an intensity that seemed impossible. His breath froze in clouds that glittered in the starlight. Otto Richter stood alone near the tree line, a dark shape against the snow. Hartmann walked over to him. "You should not have sung," Otto said without turning. "I sang a Christmas carol, the same carol they were singing. There was no betrayal in that." "You make it seem like we are the same, like there is no difference between us and them." "Maybe there is not," Hartmann said quietly. "Maybe that is what I am learning here, that people are people no matter which uniform they wear." Otto turned to face him. In the starlight his face was haggard, desperate. "If you believe that, then the Reich died for nothing. Everything we sacrificed was meaningless." "Perhaps it was." "No." Otto's voice rose. "No, that cannot be true." Hartmann looked at him and felt something close to pity. "I know what you are planning, Otto. I have seen you with your 3 friends. I have seen the maps you draw. I have heard the whispered conversations about escape." Otto's face went rigid. "Do not do it," Hartmann said. "The winter here will kill you. You will die in the snow for nothing but pride. Better to die free than live as a slave. You are not a slave. You are a prisoner who is being treated better than you deserve. And if you run, you will prove that you cannot be trusted. The rest of you are already traitors. What do I care what happens to traitors? Hartman sighed. Then I will not try to stop you. But know that when you freeze to death out there, you will die for nothing. The war is lost, Otto. Germany is lost. And no amount of fanatical devotion will change that. He walked away, leaving Otto alone in the cold. 2 days after Christmas, the temperature dropped to 5 below zero. The sky turned the color of old iron, and at dawn, a storm swept in from the north, the first real blizzard of winter. Snow fell thick and fast, driven by winds that howled through the camp like hungry wolves. The prisoners huddled in their cabins, grateful for the stoves and blankets and the day off that Earl Dawson granted without being asked. But at 2 in the afternoon, Dawson appeared at Hartman's cabin, his face grim. 4 prisoners are missing, he said through the interpreter. We think they tried to escape during the storm. We need volunteers to help search. Hartman stood immediately. I will go. Klaus joined him. We both will. They dressed in every layer they owned and followed Dawson to where Harold McAfee and Lieutenant Cooper were organizing search parties. The storm was worsening, the visibility dropping to perhaps 50 feet. They took a boat from the shore, McAfee said, shouting over the wind. Tried to row across the lake. The boat's been found capsized about a mile out. We need to search the shore and the woods in case they made it that far. Hartman's heart sank. The lake was perhaps 2 miles across at its narrowest point. In this storm, in this cold, with waves and wind, the chances of survival were almost zero. I think I know where they might go, Hartman said. If they survived the water, there is a direction they spoke about, northeast toward Canada. Cooper looked at him sharply. You knew they were planning this. I suspected. I tried to talk them out of it. But you did not report it. No. That is aiding an escape attempt. You could be sent back to a maximum security facility for that. Hartman met his eyes. I know. But I also know that reporting would have made me an informer. And I have seen what happens to informers. He paused. Also, I hoped they would change their minds, that they would see what I see, that running is death. Cooper studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Let's go find them before they freeze. The search party moved northeast, following the shore of the lake. The snow was knee-deep in places, the wind cutting through their layers like they were paper. Hartman had never been so cold. His face was numb, his fingers losing feeling inside his gloves. They found the first body half a mile from where the boat had capsized. He had crawled onto the shore and then collapsed, his clothes frozen solid ice crystals in his hair and beard. He had been dead for hours. The second body was another quarter-mile on, curled in the fetal position under a pine tree, as if sleep had simply claimed him. They found Otto Richter a mile inland, still alive, but barely. He was hypothermic delirious, his skin blue-white and waxy. One other prisoner was with him in only slightly better condition. We need to get them back now, Cooper said, or they will all die. They fashioned stretchers from pine branches and coats. The journey back took 3 hours, the storm fighting them every step. By the time they reached camp, Hartman could not feel his feet. His face was covered in ice from his frozen breath. The doctor worked on Otto and the other survivor for hours. The fourth man died during the night, his heart simply giving up after too much cold and too much strain. Otto survived, though he lost 3 toes to frostbite. The next morning, Hartman visited him in the camp's small infirmary. Otto lay on a cot, his face grey, his eyes haunted. You came for me, Otto said. His voice was barely a whisper. Yes. Why I called you a traitor. I planned to escape. You should have let me die. Hartman sat down on the edge of the cot. Because letting you die would have made me the monster you thought the Americans were. Because you are still a human being, even if you are a foolish one. Because that is what humans do, they save each other even when they disagree. Otto closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his cheek. I was wrong, he whispered. About everything. The propaganda, the Reich,
All of it. I was wrong. I know. What do I do now? How do I live with knowing I believed lies? The same way I do, the same way we all do. One day at a time, one honest action at a time, until we become something better than what we were. Otto nodded slowly, then turned his face to the wall. Winter deepened after that. January brought temperatures that made December seem warm. The work continued, trees falling in the frozen forest, logs hauled through snow that sometimes reached their waists. Hartman's English improved until he could hold real conversations with Harold McAfee, discussing carpentry techniques and the differences between American and German tools. In February, a letter arrived from his mother. The envelope was worn, the stamps foreign, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. "My dear Dietrich," she wrote, "your letter reached us on January the 3rd, a miracle in itself. Stuttgart is not the city you remember. The bombing has been terrible. But we are alive, Dietrich. We are alive. Greta works in a factory now. She is strong. She sends her love. Know that we wait for you. Know that we love you. Know that whatever you have become, you are still my son." Hartman read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it inside Sarah McAfee's phrasebook. His mother and sister were alive. That was enough. That was everything. March brought the first hints of spring. The ice on the lake began to crack and groan. Snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass beneath. And with spring came news that everyone had been waiting for. On the morning of May 8th, Earl Dawson assembled all the prisoners in the mess hall. His face was grave. The radio was turned on. "Germany has surrendered," Dawson said. The interpreter translated, though most of the prisoners had already understood. "The war in Europe is over." The silence in the hall was absolute. No cheers, no celebration, just silence, heavy and complete. Then, one by one, the prisoners began to react. Some wept, some sat in stunned silence. Konrad Fleischer covered his face with his hands and sobbed like a child. Klaus Brenner stared at the floor, his jaw working but no sound coming out. Hartman felt nothing at first. Then slowly a wave of emotion rolled through him. Not grief exactly, not relief. Something more complex. Something that tasted like freedom and loss and uncertainty all mixed together. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything he had been taught about German superiority, about the inevitable triumph of the Reich, all of it was ash. And he was still alive. Summer came to Princeton. The logging continued, though everyone knew it was temporary now. In late June, newsreels arrived showing the liberation of the concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, mountains of corpses, living skeletons, children with hollow eyes. The images burned themselves into Hartman's brain. He had known in an abstract way that camps existed. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. This was industrial murder. This was evil on a scale that defied comprehension. Otto Richter watched the footage in silence. Afterward, he sought out Hartman. "You were right," he said quietly. "About everything. We did this. Germans did this. And I gave them my loyalty. What will you do now? Live with it. Remember it. Make sure it never happens again." Otto looked at him with hollow eyes. That is all any of us can do. In the fall of 1945, the camp doctor conducted final weigh-ins. Hartman stepped on the scale and watched the needle settle at 164 pounds. He had gained 27 pounds since October of the previous year. His face was tanned and weathered from a year of outdoor work. His arms were strong. His hands were calloused but skilled. He looked like a different person than the hollow-eyed prisoner who had stepped off that truck 13 months ago. He was a different person. April of 1946 brought the news they had been waiting for. Repatriation would begin. Hartman's name appeared on the list for April 15th. On his final day, Harold McAfee found him packing his few belongings. "Got something for you," McAfee said. He held out an axe. Not just any axe, his personal axe, the one Hartman had watched him use that first day in the forest. The handle was worn smooth by decades of use. "I can't," Hartman started. "You can," McAfee interrupted. "You're a carpenter. Good carpenter needs good tools."
"This axe is 75 years old. My grandfather used it, my father used it, I used it, and now you'll use it." Hartman took the axe carefully, feeling the weight of it, the history contained in the worn wood and aged steel. "Thank you," he said, and the words were completely inadequate. "Go home, Dietrich. Build something good." Sarah McAfee appeared. She held out a photograph showing Hartman and several other prisoners standing in front of one of the cabins. On the back, "To Dietrich, friend across the fence. Sarah McAfee, Princeton, Maine, 1945. Lieutenant Cooper was the last to say goodbye. He shook Hartman's hand. "Go build something good, Hartman. Be the man Tom would have wanted to know." The ship that carried him back to Europe departed on April 20th. The crossing took 8 days. Hartman spent most of that time on deck, Harold McAfee's axe wrapped carefully in canvas at his feet, watching the horizon for the first glimpse of land. Germany, when he finally saw it, looked like something from a nightmare. The train from Hamburg to Stuttgart took 2 days because so many rail lines had been destroyed. When it finally pulled into Stuttgart's damaged station on May 3rd, Hartman climbed down with his small pack and the axe. Whole blocks were just rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth. People moved through the streets like ghosts. His mother stood in the doorway of what remained of their house. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then she rushed forward and pulled him into an embrace. "You're alive," she kept saying. "You're alive." Greta appeared behind her, no longer 16 but 18, thin and work-hardened, but with the same bright eyes. That evening, Hartman showed them Harold McAfee's axe. He told them about the camp without fences, about the hot water and the food, about learning English, about the Christmas when enemies sang together. His mother listened in silence. When he finished, she said only, "They were kind to you." "Yes. Then you must be kind in return. You must build with this axe, not destroy." The next day, Hartman began to rebuild. The roof first, then the walls, then the floors. Within a month, his reputation spread. People came asking him to repair their homes, to build furniture, to teach them techniques. But Germany, in 1947, was divided and broken. Hartman could not stay. Every street corner reminded him of what had been, of what was lost, of the lies he had believed. In March of 1948, he told his mother and sister he was leaving. "Canada," he said. "They are accepting German immigrants." Earl Dawson wrote a letter of recommendation. Harold McAfee wrote another. Lieutenant Cooper wrote a third. His mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Go. Build a new life. Know that I am proud of you." The ship left from Hamburg on April 8, 1948. Hartman stood at the rail with Harold McAfee's axe in his hands and watched Europe disappear behind him. He never returned. Canada gave him work. He married in 1954, had 2 children. In 1952, he earned his master carpenter's license. In 1963, he opened his own shop. He taught apprentices, trained young carpenters, passed on, not just the technical skills, but the philosophy he had learned in a logging camp in Maine, that good work was honest work, that trust was earned through competence and character, that strength did not require cruelty. Over the decades, Harold McAfee's axe built 47 houses. It trained 3 generations of apprentices. The handle was replaced twice, the head resharpened hundreds of times, but it was still recognizably the same tool. In 2015, at the age of 93, Hartman donated the axe to the Princeton Historical Society. He traveled back to Maine for the first time since 1946, accompanied by his daughter Anna. The Historical Society held a small ceremony. Harold McAfee had died in 1998, but his son James was there. Sarah McAfee was there now, a retired teacher in her 80s, still sharp-eyed and curious. Before Hartman spoke, The museum director read from a letter written by Klaus Brenner in 1991, 4 years before his death. One winter in America turned everything upside down. They did not hate us. They did not abuse us. They treated us like men who happened to be on the wrong side of a war. I have never forgotten that. It taught me that enemies are not always what we are told they are. The director looked up. Klaus Brenner died in Vancouver in 1997. But his words live on. And now Dietrich Hartmann, the last survivor of Princeton camp, will speak. Hartmann held the axe one last time, feeling the smooth wood, the perfectly balanced weight. Then he placed it in a glass case labeled Tool of Transformation, used by POW Dietrich Hartmann at Princeton logging camp, 1944 to 1946. Gift of the donor, 2015. This axe taught me to build, he said in his speech, his English still faintly accented after 67 years. But the man who gave it to me taught me something more important. He taught me that enemies are just people on the other side of a line that someone else drew. That trust can cross that line. That kindness is not weakness, but the truest strength. I came to Maine as a prisoner. I left as a man. And I spent 70 years trying to earn the gift I was given here, the gift of being seen as human when I had every reason to be seen as enemy. If my story teaches anything, let it teach this, that fences are a choice, not a necessity, that trust is possible even across the deepest divisions, that the future does not have to repeat the past. He lived 9 more years after that. In the spring of 2024, at the age of 102, Dietrich Hartmann died peacefully in a nursing home in Kitchener, Ontario. In Princeton, Maine, in a small historical society museum, Harold McAfee's axe remains on display. The handle is worn smooth by a century of hands. The head is smaller than it once was, shaped and reshaped by countless sharpenings. But it endures. And on certain quiet afternoons when the light slants just right through the museum windows, you can almost see what it represents. The choice to trust instead of fear. The decision to build instead of destroy. In Princeton, the loons still call across Pokemoonshine Lake. The forest still stands where the camp once was. The trees that replaced those the prisoners cut now tall and straight and strong. The men are gone. The camps are gone. The war itself has passed beyond living memory into history. But the lesson remains. Trust is possible. Understanding is possible. Even enemies can find common ground when they are given the chance. The forest without fences taught that lesson to men who had been trained to hate, and some of them carried it home, planted it in the ruins of their own country, and watched it grow into something that looked from a distance remarkably like peace. The axe remains, and the lesson it taught remains with it, always, even now, even here, even you.